Thank you very much to you, Mark, and to the audience. And thank you for all the brilliant interventions earlier this day. I tried to follow what was told here in front and to understand, to absorb it. Wasn't always easy, but I had a couple of conversations with colleagues, and it was not a monopoly. I mean, I was not the only one that had sometimes difficulties to catch up with the explanation here in the front, which already points at a gap between political decision makers, policy makers sometimes, and very savvy people that are active in a particular, very rapidly evolving domain. I would like to make, I would like to testify, to share my experience trying to handle the banking crisis and financial crisis in a mid-size European Union member state some 10, 12 years ago. I would like to share my experience in, let's say, concentrating, focusing on 5 elements, which I think are important, addressing cases of emergency, 5 aspects which I think are critical to address cases of emergency, situations of emergencies in a very effective way. The number one, I think, of my experience, one of the most striking elements of my experience with tackling the banking and financial crisis was that for me it was quite new to see how psychological and emotional elements are often forgotten when we design policies. To put a little bit more concrete, when a Friday noon suddenly we heard about the running on the bank on one of our systemic banks in Belgium, at that time we had 4, and one of these banks was experiencing problems in their different subsidiaries all over the country because people were withdrawing their cash physically on the counter and also via the cash machines. And so at 11, 12 in the morning, it was not a surprise because they had taken over a Dutch bank and there were lots of doubts into the market whether they had the sufficient access to credit to finance the takeover. It was the Fortis Bank that was taking over ABN AMRO at that time. And so at 11 that Friday, we got a phone call, the Minister of Finance and me, that there was a potential run on the bank. And the governor of the central bank was called by us to the, we were just meeting as a government like every Friday. And he said, Prime Minister, you should very urgently be on the screen at the news programs at 1 p.m. today. And you should find the right tone of voice to convince the average Belgian citizens that there is no issue in terms of running to the bank and ask all your savings and all the money on the bank accounts for the Belgian average citizens. The issue was, of course, the lack of trust people had based on what was in the newspapers and the media that their money was in safe hands. And so whatever prudential control policy, whatever kind of other very sophisticated approaches, decisions had been made already to counter the issues that bank was facing, at the end of the day, it was what was happening these 2-3 hours that Friday morning. And the question was, can we convince the people through a very clear message that they should not run to the bank to ask their savings. You know, the whole banking system is based on trust that the bank can always pay back your money, and they have to have something like a couple of percentage of what they have as on the accounts in figures in cash to pay out to the people. And then we had a couple of sentences we decided that we would communicate, and it worked. But so emotional, psychological elements. A little bit further into the banking crisis, I bumped into the issue of greed. It is normal that people seek for profit. The issue is at a certain moment that this, going for profit starts to become greed with a very negative impact on other stakeholders and on other parts of the job that have to be done. There's the issue of hope, giving a perspective to people. So emotional, psychological elements play a very important role. Let me make it very concrete in terms of the discussion we had this morning, when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about the potential of blockchain technology, of cryptocurrencies, and the immense advantages of these innovations, let's always keep in mind that we have to have inclusive approaches, financial education and others, so that everybody is on board. And that's, of course, a responsibility for political office holders. So emotional, psychological elements. Second item I want to put forward as a very essential when, based on my humble experience in successfully tackling the banking issue in Belgium, is the role played by the scale, the volume, the scale. With a negative aspect, to put it very clearly, when in my office room with Jean-Claude Trichet, Mrs. Lagarde, then within the finance minister of France, serving as the rotating chair of the European Union, my central banker, my minister of finance, at a certain moment, two systemic Belgian banks came in the room a Sunday afternoon, and we asked them, what do you need as guarantees? And they were putting forward, the one was putting forward a figure of 200 billion euros, and the other one 240 billion. I was like starting to be shaky, because when I added up the two figures, this was more than our GDP. And so the scale, the volume of these processes, the potential impact of these processes that are underpinning our financial system, or let's say, out of size for national authorities, for national licensors. And that's the reason why some banks were too big to fail. That's one of the reasons. But they were also too big to be saved for a single nation. So the issue of scale is always important to be taken fully on board. And based on my humble experience, I think that sometimes very intelligent and very, which I say without irony, very, very skilled and savvy people in the tech sector and the fintech sector sometimes underestimate. Because at the end of the day, they always operate with a national license until now. Of course, now under prudential control, as far as the euro is concerned, of the European Central Bank, and the same goes for American banks and so on. But at the end of the day, it's always a national authority that has to make sure that the bank is kept under control and that the money that people put into the bank accounts is guaranteed. Now it's 100,000 euros in the Eurozone. But if you multiply this with the number of holders of saving accounts and bank accounts, you very rapidly come to figures like 240 billion euros. To end that second element with also a little bit of experience, during the first wave of the banking crisis, it was also the summit of the Francophonie, and I had to travel at least for half a day to Canada. And I decided to pass through Reykjavik. Why Reykjavik, a Friday afternoon? Because there were a couple of Icelandic banks that were on the brink of collapsing. And I had some Belgian clients that had put their savings there. I will never forget when I met my then colleague, I think it was Mr. Harder, when I met him in his small office in Reykjavik, where Iceland was in charge, because of the license, of guaranteeing the sustainability of the activities of a couple of Icelandic banks whose assets they were having, and their activities, how you call this, their turnover, was much more than maybe 10, 15 times the GDP of Iceland. And I can tell you at that time that meeting Mr. Harder, my dear fellow colleague Mr. Harder, it was about, he was anxious, and not theoretically anxious, but as history has proven, he was right, that it was endangering not only his political career, but also his existence as a free citizen. I mean, the scale of what is happening in fintech world at a certain moment can be very dangerous for national authorities. To really conclude that point with a positive example, a Friday afternoon, it often is the Friday that we have important moments in the banking crisis. We traveled with our Minister of Finance to Standard & Poor's that were telling us that they would downgrade Belgium We had a meeting with a couple of young professionals of Standard & Poor's and Fitch, and we were under the impression of the lack of wisdom and the lack of factual knowledge of these people that would publish the Monday morning a down rating of our credibility, so to say, on the financial markets. And that would impact our taxpayers because that would mean would be more expensive to borrow money. The scale, I bring the concept of scale because on the high-speed train back to Brussels, my finance minister and myself, we said, well, let's maybe use the very high saving quote we have in Belgium. And let's prepare a state bond over the weekend with very attractive conditions, and let's try to mobilize the savings of the Belgian citizens. And this went very well. In 4 or 5 days, we could say to the financial markets, well, guys, it's interesting what you produce as paperwork and all kinds of statements. It's senseless because you clearly don't have a clue about how Belgium works and what the real economic situation is of Belgium. But we could say, okay, issue your statements and downrate us. We have 22 billion euros from the Belgian citizens, which leads us in a position not to have to go to the financial markets anymore for 18 months. And so you won't make at least profit on speculating against Belgium. So psychological elements, scale. 3, the essential element of time, and the time is running out. Time, I already told you, the Friday afternoon, we had a window of a couple of hours. In policy making, and the issue of time in the banking crisis was that to allow breakthroughs in terms of policy making to address these kinds of crises, you sometimes are too early to come up with solutions. I remember that we had a summit of the Eurozone called by Sarkozy at the Élysée, and that we as a Benelux, we wanted to tell the colleagues that these banks we had licensed, that they were too big to be saved by Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands separately, and that we called for a European solution. And we were then confronted with a 9 from Angela Merkel and a no from Nicolas Sarkozy. The element of time is that it lasted 18-24 months before Sarkozy and Merkel were asking themselves for a European solution, because we already knew that we were too small. Nicolas and Angela at that moment didn't know yet that they were too small to save on their own German and French banks. Elements of time. 4, complexity and transparency. A lot about blockchain, cryptocurrency, and at that time about what was happening in the financial sector was not understood by the average citizen. And so you could not have a real basis for the trust I already pointed at. But moreover, when we were questioning the members of the board of important banks that were in trouble, like Dexia Holding, for instance, we were asking people we knew that were even friends, people that afterwards would become prime minister of my country. And I asked, well, Elio, Karel, why have you been approving as a member of the board of directors of Dexia Holding all these very complex investment and very complex, sophisticated financial products? Some of them very honestly said, Yves, sorry, and Herman van Rompuy, my successor, they told us, these people, very, very intelligent people, well, we didn't really understand, but these bankers always came up with very impressive figures, profit, and they told us, in order to stay competitive, that we had to join as a bank this dynamic of financiarization of the economy and of investment in very complex products. Complexity, transparency, I think there's always a need for transparency to be the basis of trust. Last element, 10 seconds, Mark, I already pointed at it, the clash between territoriality of sovereignty and the exercise of public authority, and on the other hand, the global, borderless dynamics of finance economy. I think in terms of the banking system, this is a very important point where I think we find a little bit of a solution by widening all these kinds of systems, at least from a national level to a European level. But I think that now we are confronted with the challenge, given the dynamics and the massive volumes of the current fintech, to go from a regional, European and others, American, to a more global approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yves Leterme.